Hello, and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum, the show where two or more trained political scientists try to explain the post-war world first to ourselves and then hopefully to you. I am your host, Steve Pally. I'm the least academic of our esteemed guests today. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson of Williams College. We have back with us for at least a short time, Professor Andrew Lieber of Tulane University. And joining us is our good friend from UCLA, Associate Professor of Political Science at UCSB, University of California at Santa Barbara, Professor Pasha Madavi. How are you doing, Pasha? It's been a minute.
It has been, but I am super excited to be here on Global Tantrum. I was trying to find a can of Tantrum to bring as a prop. I used to drink that stuff as a teenager, but I think it's been off the market for several presidential administrations. So
It's
we'll have to
probably
do
for the
without
best.
can. Yes,
So,
yeah, I think
so
it had yellow 9 or something in it, but yeah.
okay, so the federal deregulatory push
Yes.
hasn't affected Yellow 9, I guess. We haven't
The
gotten
good
Guess
stuff.
not.
yeah, the good
Yeah,
stuff.
there you go. But no,
Yeah.
excited to be here. Thanks for
Yeah,
having me,
so
guys.
yeah, thanks for coming on. We know that Andrew is an expert on the Gulf monarchies. Pasha, you're an expert on a lot of different things, but one of them is the politics of energy, extraction and nationalization and trade. Obviously, this war, the Iran war, which is currently on pause, and we'll talk about that, has had major implications on energy prices in the United States and outside the United States, in kind of like a rippling waveform that's starting to break across various global markets in energy. So we'll dive into that. But let's just start with setting the table in terms of what's going on with this conflict. The conflict is on pause. It has been on pause for a week. I think last week, Gail and you and I arrived at like the sort of 66 to 75% conclusion that this ceasefire would result in some kind of deal. The parties are apparently, perhaps, maybe talking again. Iran and the US, maybe again in Islamabad. Last we checked, J.D. Vance, the vice president, went there for negotiations, came away empty-handed. So the response was to blockade we have a double blockade on the Strait of Hormuz now. So we can talk about the double blockade because Iran was still successfully exporting its oil while stopping everybody else from exporting. That's not happening anymore, apparently. And we might be heading back to the negotiation table. So a lot of ins, a lot of outs, a lot of what have yous when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz and the Iran war. I want to take everybody's temperature, though. Like, let's just start, like, are we still feeling optimistic about the prospects of a lasting peace and a larger deal, or do we think that the double blockade is going to ultimately result in renewed hostilities? Let's start with Galen. Like, where are you at on this?
Yeah, I mean, I would take a little bit of issue with the word "still" in the question.
Fair enough.
I think what we predicted was the ceasefire would hold.
Okay.
Was a 2-week ceasefire, and I think we technically are already wrong since a blockade is an act of war. So even if
Fair.
bombs are getting dropped on Iran, I think we do have to say we're wrong on that. I think it was just announced that Israel and Lebanon will have like a 10-day ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
No, I am not optimistic.
Not sanguine.
No, I mean, even leaving aside Iran, which we'll talk about a lot, the situation in Lebanon is like really horrific now.
Yeah.
Something like a fifth of the country's population has been displaced. The Israelis have now moved all the way up to the Litani River, and as of this morning, I think blew up the last bridge that connects southern Lebanon to the rest of the country, are more or less telling Lebanon to keep all Shia out of the south on suspicion that they are aligned with Hezbollah
members.
Yeah. And, you know, I don't see, I think the Trump administration is in a tough spot because after bashing the JCPOA for this long, it really wants to get a better deal than that agreement. And I think that is going to be difficult to do. So I do think that the ceasefire, leaving aside the blockade, will hold until April 21st. And I still think that Trump does not want to recommence with the shooting
Hmm.
But over the longer term, no, I would say I'm definitively not optimistic about the
Okay.
situation.
Okay, got it. All right. Thank you for clarifying on
Yeah.
what exactly we put a percentage on last week. My memory is not the best anymore. Cool. All right, let's go in vertical order from the people in little windows on my screen. Andrew, how are you feeling about the ceasefire from your perspective?
I don't want to just piggyback, but I guess I feel similarly in that in the one direction, I don't see how this remains a ceasefire through like November, because it seems like the interests on both sides are opposed enough. The potential for spoilers, especially from Israel, is high enough that it's hard to see getting to an agreement that people all agree to enough. But at the same time, it's also hard to see that restarting in the immediate term, which is a wishy-washy answer that doesn't really come down in a good place, I guess. But I feel like we're going to keep just seeing extensions of talks, and then we're going to trip over some kind of sticking point between the two sides that's going to see, and again, a return to the use of force. And I keep going back to in my mind in terms of more nightmare scenarios, the fact that like Iran closed out the time before the ceasefire by like letting various Gulf states know they could still hit all of the pipelines carrying some oil out of
Right.
the Persian Gulf into the broader ocean, which seems to be. Anyway, to sum all of that up, I would say I'm not optimistic about this translating into a durable peace deal.
I believe somebody on Iran's side, maybe it was an IRGC higher up, explicitly highlighted the Red Sea this time as well. So they could activate the Houthis, although it's not clear to what extent the Houthis would be activated because, their incentives are not completely aligned with Iran. But yeah, it's like we can hit your pipelines, and oh, by the way, we can probably choke off your lifeline in the Red Sea as well. So I would agree that's not promising. How are the Gulf monarchies feeling at this point in time?
Yeah, it's interesting. You can already see kind of the evolution, though, in that now that the dust has a little bit of time to settle, the initial shock is worn off. There's more of a stock taking, I think, like pointing out that so Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pipelines that can get out around the Strait of Hormuz. With the increase in oil prices, they've obviously suffered expensive damage. They're obviously not exporting as much of the higher value refined stuff. But in terms of raw revenue, they're like not terribly off relative to prior to the war.
Hmm.
Oman is like breaking it in because they're exporting just about as much oil at much higher global prices. And then countries like Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait are really kind of trapped. You've also seen, this may have already been in the works, but like Saudi Arabia just re-upped its major investment policy. And now they're talking about Neom, the fantastical city in the west of the country, as like this major logistics hub. And it's like, isn't it convenient that we have this backup new city that could connect everywhere else, but that is conveniently like farther away from the rockets? Now, I've heard Saudi friends and occasionally officials talking about like, well, one advantage of Saudi Arabia is that it's physically very large. And so it takes even, like, oh, it takes so long for the drones to fly overhead that we have more opportunity to shoot them down by the time they get to like, the Red Sea side of things.
That's brilliant marketing. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah. Yeah, we have more chances to shoot down the drones that are coming for your warehouses, your data centers. I think in general, my sense at this point is that Saudi Arabia is fairly locked into their perspective that they would like the talks to go well and are happy to pay something similar to the arrangement they probably have with the Houthis. They want the talks to go well. There were reports I found pretty credible that they're not wild about like the double blockade, because the rest of the global economy just wants oil and energy supplies coming out of the Gulf, whereas the Gulf states understandably would also like other supplies to go in, like broccoli, apparently. And then, other things too, no doubt, but that being one of them. And then it was interesting that even the UAE, which has been the most, shall we say, bellicose in its statements, presenting itself as like the military partner of the United States in the region, even they, like a high-ranking Emirati official, had a phone call with an Iranian counterpart recently just to talk about resolving regional hostilities. So there may be even a trend in that direction towards, well, maybe we should make sure that these talks go well. That could be a good opportunity for us. So I think there's generally a hope that the talks go well and that but it'll be awareness that it'll be a changed economic reality afterwards.
Yeah. And to your point, some of the Gulf countries have gotten more screwed than others by this. I think Iraq and Kuwait are 100% screwed, pretty much, as like just geographically speaking. And it's interesting that Oman is actually making more money. They're actually doing quite well, you know? So there's some differential effects here. The global economy at large is not doing well because, yes, the price is higher for these producers, but the supply is getting choked off. Right, Pasha? So first I'm going to ask you what's your temperature on the ceasefire turning into some kind of deal without additional fighting? And two, like what's about to happen as a result of like all the fighting that has already happened and now this double blockade?
I'm similarly not very optimistic. I don't necessarily see anything having changed here. Effectively, we've gotten a quote unquote pause on certain activities, but as Galen mentioned, blockade is its own form of military action. I It's hard to see how this is going to lead to any deal that is going to be acceptable to both sides, given what we had seen from the prior kind of 10-point plan the Iranians put forward, and of course what the US has been trying to achieve in terms of what would you want to call it, a JCPOA plus? Like I don't
Yeah.
exactly know how different it is from that. So I'm not very optimistic about this current moment. The other problem is that, the Iranian regime has become even more entrenched in their position because you've gotten the rise of even more extreme hardliners replacing those that have been killed during this war. It's not just Mushtaba, the son of Ali Khamenei, who's more extreme than him, but it's kind of the IRGC really digging in around the country and taking over. Beforehand, it had been kind of a complicated web of kind of people that are, vying for power, including the IRGC. But now you've got even more, takeover by some of those hardliners. The energy side, the challenge is, I mean, all that, what Andrew was saying is true about the Saudis and their ability to ramp up, say the East-West pipeline, the capacity that some countries have to get their product to market versus the others that don't have that. The challenge there is that, most of that is focused around oil. The big, burning red light right now is gas. LNG is still a problem area. Right now, it's okay because we're in this kind of spring period. Gas demand in Asia is relatively low. But as this war continues and as, demand for gas is going to increase, then you'll see even higher prices. And LNG really can't find its way out through kind of those east-west pipelines. It's much more difficult to do that. And that hits Qatar the hardest. They are the ones that suffer the most from that. They were providing 70% of Asia's LNG. And that number people quote, about 20% of oil that goes through the Strait of Hormuz, that's true for LNG as well. So that's a harder thing to get around. And not to mention all the damage that had been done to LNG facilities in Qatar. So that's like a multi-year problem. So that's one side of it. The other thing is it's not clear what the Iranians will try to do when this ceasefire is over. Are they going to try to attack more oil and gas infrastructure? Because that's where you start to get these longer term effects. So far, we have seen that at a very minimal scale for oil. I mentioned gas where that's higher, but that could change. And that really could create the shockwave we have not quite yet seen. And markets, and in fact, you're asking us here, but if you ask the markets, as it were, the wisdom of the crowds, they would say, well, neither optimistic nor pessimistic. They're still just in this weird purgatory phase of uncertainty. Oil prices are still high, but not that high.
Right.
They're not low either. And it's just everybody's kind of waiting to see what exactly is going to happen. So uncertainty is still the name of the game when it comes to, people's temperature on the market side of things.
Yeah, and I think that uncertainty extends to the main belligerents in this war, the United States and Iran. The way I am currently looking at it is that neither side really wants to continue fighting, but at the same time, there are still some intractable, I guess, issues at stake for both. One is control of the Strait of Hormuz. One is the status of Iran's nuclear plan. I think the idea of regime change has been abandoned completely by the administration because
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
and they said, well, I don't know. I chuckle because Trump said the regime has changed. So I
Yeah,
don't know
right.
what you mean. I mean,
For the worse. Yeah.
yeah, right. But I was going to interject as well, which is that I'm not sure neither side doesn't want to keep fighting. I think the Iranians are not opposed to that. It seems like this regime gets its power from this kind of martyrdom mentality.
From taking
that
punishment, right?
Yeah, well, that too, but it goes
Yeah.
back to the Iran-Iraq War. It goes back to Khomeini and kind of those first 2 years of Khomeini's regime were really unstable. And in many ways, Saddam did him a favor by invading in 1980. And, 82, everybody thought it would stop. But the next 6 years really entrenched this idea of, the world is against us being the mullahs, the Ayatollah. And they feed off of that. And they, I think that they're not opposed to more fighting on their terms.
Right.
You were right, I think, in the sense of a larger scale. I think they've lost that capacity to whatever extent they had it. But they're comfortable with, these kinds of quote unquote unconventional warfare, sending drones, maybe, protecting areas from ground forces like Harg Island or, the greater and lesser Tomb Islands or Lorak and all these other islands in the Strait of Hormuz. So they're not opposed to it. That's kind of why I interjected is I'm not sure that they don't have the stomach for it because they seem to.
That's
a
fair.
scary proposition.
Yeah, it's fair, and I don't disagree. The puzzle for us that we were trying to figure out is why they ever accepted this ceasefire in the first place.
Well,
actually, yeah, go ahead.
Well, first, I want to thank Pasha for, reinforcing to my students why studying the Iran-Iraq War is really important.
It is.
Yeah.
For this exact reason. The other party that I think does not want the war to stop is Israel, but we can get back to that. I think I would think about it slightly differently, which is I think the puzzle you just said, Steve, you can solve it if you think of it as Iran would like the situation to continue. And if the shooting stops, it's the best of both worlds. So they can dig out all their launchers and missiles from these sites where they were not destroyed, take advantage of the ceasefire to dig that stuff out, kind of rearm. Obviously, it's not in their interest to have bombs dropping on them. But I take Pasha's point that the longer that the situation continues, I think they're willing to live with that. We'll have to see how much pressure the U.S. counter blockade brings to bear. They can't get any revenue. That's an open-ended thing. I also want to echo what he said about the hardliners. I'm not sure how much stock I put in like these guys being influenced completely by apocalyptic thinking, but there was a report in the Wall Street Journal that basically made that claim. And we've now elevated guys like Vahidi, Holdadar, and like really hardline guys within the government now. And the last point I'll make on, I guess, an additional point of pessimism is the reporting I've seen now on what the Kushner-Witkoff talks yielded before the shooting started was that Iran was now offering to dilute their 60% enriched uranium down to 20.
Fair enough, is it?
It's not, well, for a few reasons. One, that's far above what the JCPOA was, so that still is a problem for Trump politically. And two, if you know your nuclear physics, 20% is really not that far away from bomb grade. It might sound like it, but it only takes 2 or 3 months to enrich to 90%, whereas the JCPOA extended that to more like a year.
Right.
So, and one other point, since you mentioned Iraq, I would keep your eye on Iraq, by the way. It has, somewhat to my surprise, not exploded into Tyrian warfare, but I think that could change pretty quickly depending on how things go.
Yeah. Let's drill down on that. Let's double tap on that. Andrew, do you have contacts in Iraq?
No, I was just going to offer to say some things about where I do have any idea what I'm talking about because I got to leave in a moment. But that would be just there's a couple of things. I mean, on the Red Sea question, one thing that I think maybe it was the Adode from Bloomberg emphasized, but that was like shipping is already quite down through the Red Sea. Like I'm sure what remains is pretty high value stuff, but thus far, whatever combination of Houthi calculations and Saudi incentives are at play has managed to make it so that like Saudi Arabia's fine with the occasional missile launched over its territory towards Israel, whatever. But that has not become a major area yet. And it's hard to know how much of talking about the Red Sea is just kind of Iran gesturing at what might happen, but that would
Right.
also affect kind of a lot of the plans for what ways to kind of get out or get around from the crisis. The only other point I have to make, which is a silly one and not directly related, but to the question of the Iran-Iraq war, I was at like a board game convention over this weekend, long story. And there's
Oh.
a potentially in production game called Chalice of Poison, the Iran-Iraq war, which is like a 2-player board game where you both simulate the internal politics of Iraq and Iran. And then if you can like retain power inside your regime, like
Oh,
fight your opponent,
that's a
but-
niche market, man.
Yeah, that sounds like a fun 3-day weekend to me.
Yeah,
But-
no, it's an interesting one, but you know, these things are, there are people out there, I guess, who are
yeah,
really,
pretty esoteric.
yeah, man. But in any case, thanks for having me on. As always, I got to head off, but
All right. Thanks for
forward to
coming
hearing the rest
on.
of the discussion.
Yeah.
See you,
man.
Andrew.
Yeah, take care.
Yeah. Cheers.
Okay. Yeah. Sectarian conflict in Iraq. Iraq had actually
The-
been doing a lot better recently and was undergoing like Baghdad had a construction boom. The oil revenues were flowing. The solderists were, I think, mostly quiescent. And yeah, it is kind of interesting that we haven't seen a resurgence in that sort of nastiness.
I would say one of the few bright, points in terms of Washington's decision making, which is, that's a tiny little shot glass compared
Yeah.
to all the dumb decisions they've made, but is not pursuing, alliances or deeper weapons transfers with groups like the MEK and
Yes.
other kind of separatists that I think would have made Iraq's situation far more difficult. And there was talk kind of early in the war that these are the Mujahideen in the Kurdish parts of Iraq and in
Mhm.
Turkey, of arming them
Yes.
and having them go in and that would have been a complete disaster, I think, for the region in terms of instability. And I think Iraq would have borne quite a big, piece of that. So that's part of it too. I why it hasn't quite exploded in Iraq is I think there has not been any real empowerment of any of the separatists. But it is interesting for lots of the other reasons you mentioned why we have not seen very much activity out of Iraq, especially because it too is being, squeezed. Now, there was talk from, those who are doing the tanker tracker kind of, analysis and doing the satellite data of where ships were going, that the Iranians were allowing Iraqi ships out when they had closed the Strait of Hormuz. And there was, even before people started talking about the toll, there was a lot of, it seems like, backroom agreements between the Iranians and the Iraqis of letting Iraqi oil hit waters. But it's not really been verified, but that's what seems to maybe have placated them. But it's not clear, of course, right now, like that, none of that's happening.
Yeah.
And, the blockade, to this point about, the counter blockade that Galen raised, one of the things I wanted to mention there is that I think that's actually a bigger problem for, the Iraqis and the Gulf countries. I mean, Andrew mentioned a lot of the challenges of what they're trying to get in imports. For the Iranians, yes, it's a pain point, but this regime can withstand that kind of pressure. They are built in a way. They have 47 years of experience of the world trying to block them off from things. And, not being able to get revenue for a few months is not a problem. And in fact, their exports had been kind of at, locally high rates, or locally in terms of time. If you go back kind of about 10 years or so, things were not as good looking. So they can withstand that, and that regime did not fall apart. And they have other avenues out if they need to take them. They've done gas swaps in the past with Turkmenistan. They've tried to do more engagement with the Pakistanis. Now, that's not a pipeline that you're talking like tanker trucks and things like that, but it's an option. And of course, the Turkish, the Azerbaijanis, and the Armenians, and, the Russians would be in support of that. And then you have these, if they foresee a long counter blockade, they will make arrangements with Russia, who has been kind of supportive of them, in this process behind the scenes, in terms of, again, some kinds of swap arrangement. It's not going to be, close to 1 million barrels per day of exports, but it's, it could be something that gives them a lifeline.
Right.
So I don't see this counter blockade as being effective from a fiscal pressure standpoint. But you start talking about other things, it could, but that'll hurt many more than just the Iranians in this context. But I'm curious both of your thoughts about that. I mean, this is not the first time there's been a blockade. I mean, how successful are these kinds of things? How likely is it that would get people to the negotiating table based on kind of a historical precedent and just kind of how you guys are reading this?
Galen.
Yeah, I mean, I would phrase it like in world historical terms, similar to what we were saying on successful regime change, just from the air doesn't have a lot of precedence. Blockades can cause a lot of pain, but they tend not to actually change sort of military and political facts, like the British blockade of the Central Powers during World War One. You got the turn up winter, like ordinary Germans experienced a lot of pain. The Allied blockade of Japan prior to the end of War II also inflicted enormous pain. But at the end of the day, you needed the Soviets to invade Manchuria and then drop 2 atomic bombs to yield a surrender. And I just you probably know more about this than I do, but I just want to reiterate what you said about the Iranian government. Like this is what they do.
Yeah.
I don't know how long they can sustain it for, but I suspect for quite a while. And certainly if it's a matter of months, this is why I think you're right that time is on their side.
Yeah.
And this will hurt them. It will also hurt American consumers by taking more fossil fuels off the global market. I'll leave it there for now because that'll set up my questions that I have for you. But I don't think this blockade is a game changer by any means. So
yeah. So we have seen Iran survive, if not necessarily prosper, with close to zero exports for some amount of time, right? Less than they've been getting. And I think the research on this is that autocracies can, when the pie shrinks, they can redistribute the pie. This is what we saw in Saddam Hussein's Iraq and, other places as well, like Zimbabwe or wherever you'd care to name, right? It's just like they have the security services. If they can pay the security services, then you're probably going to be okay. And it's just really hard to get a popular uprising against well-armed, well-informed, and entrenched security services. And all of that describes what is happening inside Iran as far as the regime goes. They are more hardcore. They are at least as willing to gun people down in the streets as they were before this, I would imagine, if not more. And to your earlier point, I agree. We actually talked about the Kurds and the MEK back when this thing kicked off, basically saying there was a brief dalliance between the Trump administration and the Kurds as to whether they would arm them and send them in. They decided not to do that. And we agreed that was a good thing because then you might get Turkey involved in a way.
Yes.
And that's just a recipe for chaos. Now, and on top of that, it's what could they do? Could they go to Tehran and take over? No, there's not enough of them. They're not well enough armed. And it would incite nationalist resistance from the Persian majority. So it's it would be counterproductive. So it's just as well that it didn't happen.
The other thing,
absolutely.
I didn't know some of these alternative outs that you mentioned, Pasha, that they have, but that was the other thing I would have said, just, from the theoretical literature, is authoritarian governments in this position are generally pretty good at finding workarounds. I don't know how easy it's going to be to get their exports across land borders, but I suspect that they will find a way to at least cushion some of the blow of taking a lot of this oil off the world market by finding additional workarounds like that.
Yeah. The one piece of this that is still an open question for me is the Chinese piece. And Galen, you and I talked about this last week. It was one reason for optimism on my part that's maybe unfounded. But the Chinese have cards to play basically against all parties to the conflict, including the United States and Iran and the Gulf monarchies and Russia, not so much Israel. And we'll get back to those guys. But in terms of the main belligerents, it's they have leverage there that they could use. And this blockade is mostly, more than anybody, going to hurt the Asians. The Asian countries that do not have over 1 billion barrels in their strategic reserves like the Chinese do. So the Chinese can wait this out for some amount of time, but like they've got to be dismayed by this sequence of events. And we've argued about that too. It's like maybe they're not. Maybe they want the US screwing up and stuck here. But at a certain point, it becomes bad for business. I have to think, because they still need a lot of hydrocarbons.
Well, they called the US blockade dangerous and irresponsible.
Yeah.
And I have not seen it confirmed. There's been like various reports they're considering getting arms to Iran. I think I saw this morning that had been maybe debunked, but have to wait and see. But yeah, they appear not to be happy about the US blockade.
Yeah, and that's what you'd expect. The question is whether they're going to get more directly involved and exert some diplomatic or coercive leverage. They were involved in bringing the sides together in Pakistan, is my understanding. Like they helped facilitate that, and I think that is indicative of something. But yeah, anyway, Galen, you have questions for Pasha, so let him rip.
Well, I like a few just in case people don't know. Like first, I'm fascinated by this gap between the futures and prices. So if you wouldn't mind just like explaining what those terms mean to people and like what you think accounts for this really large gap. And then if you can also put this like in historical context compared to like the oil shocks of the 1970s, both globally and then for the United States, how things are different since the US is much more efficient in how it uses energy and produces a lot more energy than it did then. So I just love to hear your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, those are great because, that first one about the gap between futures and kind of spot prices, it sounds wonky, but it's actually kind of a big reveal to some of the other questions that you've raised. And just to break it down, the idea is that oil is a commodity like many others in that it exists in a marketplace where, for some consumers, they want to buy a barrel today and they will pay that price. And that's basically the spot price. But for so many other consumers, like if you're a refinery, for example, you are thinking about, say, the summer demand for gasoline and jet fuel. And so you put in, a contract request for buying a barrel of oil in August. And you say, I'm going to need that right before Labor Day. And that's a futures price. And so usually the two things are pretty close. The gap is, $2 per barrel. But right now we had seen the gap grow to as big as I think it was $40 or $45 per barrel at its one point. That gap has shrunk a little bit. Spot prices have come back down. I think the peak spot price, which people call Brent dated, that's one of the best ones to look at, was about 140 per barrel. Now, on the major blends, there's lots of other blends, versus kind of the Brent futures you had in the high 90s. So that's kind of where that 40, 45 is. Now that spot price has come down to about 118 for kind of current delivery. And I should say, like, it's kind of a ridiculous thing because nobody actually buys barrels of oil like today. That's not how it works. And somebody from the Financial Times even did this, as kind of a game initially, but it turned out to be kind of wild. But they were just trying to get a literal barrel of oil. Well, it turns out you can't really do that. We haven't traded in barrels since like the 60s. And like you can buy a tanker sooner than you can buy an actual barrel. Right. But anyway, but it's still kind of a thing.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's and in fact, there's like a, apocrypha in kind of the oil world of like why we use the acronym BBL. Some claim that it's for barrel. Some claim that it's blue barrel, that Standard Oil used to have these steel barrels that were painted blue, but then others have discredited that. So I don't know. That's a conversation for another day. But this was, of course, after wooden barrels where it all started. But the point is like, well, why is that relevant to all this other stuff? Well, the reason the futures price, which is like the usual price you see, WTI, which is West Texas Intermediate, that's a pretty big benchmark for around the world for the kind of crude that we produce in the United States, and Brent, which is kind of a benchmark for what's produced in the North Sea, those future prices have not gone crazy. And they have not compared to both the 1973 shock, but also the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So this has not been a historic shock when it comes to how markets have reacted. When you think about the ability to purchase oil on a contract at some future point in time. That's how most of these markets tend to operate. But the gap exists because it's like, well, that's all good if you want to, prepare for the summer. But if you really want to get oil now, you are facing a shortage. And it's not really the 20 million barrels per day that goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And I'm sure Andrew's mentioned this before, but if you think about the East-West pipeline and a number of other, pipelines in the UAE, you've really got a crunch of about 12 million barrels per day. So over the course of these 47 days of the war, you're looking at about 560 million barrels that were not produced over a month and a half period. To put that in perspective, that's still well within the range of what countries have in terms of their emergency stockpiles. The International Energy Agency forces its member countries, and mainly the OECD, to maintain, beyond 90 days worth of oil in an emergency reserve, like the American Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Now, of course, that excludes China. That number is 1.25 billion barrels. And then the IEA claims that there's a total emergency stockpile of 8 billion barrels. That includes products too. So 560 million barrels is still well within what we have in terms of our inventory, in terms of kind of the ability to let it out. And that's why prices haven't gone haywire, is because, the IEA released a lot of that over the course of the last month and a half. We've now exceeded that. Basically, they were going to have to do another announcement of a release. The numbers were not exactly known, but it did seem as though it was around 450, 500 million barrels that were released. But that means they likely have 700 million barrels more. And then the Chinese, of course, as you mentioned, have about 1 billion barrels. The Japanese have like a year's worth of reserves. The Koreans also have a long time in terms of their reserves. But so that's tells you something about the oil markets. And I bring it back to Galen's last question to put that in perspective. Well, we didn't have any reserves in 1973. 73 is the reason why we have those reserves. It's the reason we have the International Energy Agency to begin with, and the 79 shock as well. So we didn't have any of that back then. Back then, it was just the spigots were turned off and nobody had anything in the pantry. So that's a different story. The other is just the bright spot on this, and this gets back to China, is we have so many more alternatives now than we used to, especially when it comes to electricity. That's the gas side of the equation more than the oil one. Renewables are the big one. And, a lot of countries in the global south have invested in renewables because of China. China has sold them all this stuff and are doing much better than they would have otherwise been doing. That includes Pakistan, Ethiopia, Namibia, many other countries that have invested in renewables. And as well, Ethiopia, for example, has a ban on importing internal combustion engines. The only new car you can buy in Ethiopia is an EV.
I did not know that.
And it comes from China. Yeah,
I didn't know that either. Yeah.
It's wild, right? Like they are moving better than California and the United States.
Yeah.
But out of necessity, right? They're like, I don't want to deal with an input fuel. Let me just buy panels from China, buy EVs from China, and charge my EVs with said panels. So it's kind of a perfect scenario. China, interestingly enough, right? So has benefited from this and would continue to benefit if it can manage releasing some of its reserves, because China set a record last year for its clean energy exports. Clean tech, $240 billion last year in export revenues. That's EVs, batteries, solar PV. Compare that to Saudi Arabia, which sold about $190 billion in petroleum exports. So just think about those two numbers, gives you a sense for like, well, China would love to keep selling clean tech and telling everybody else, telling, not just Pakistan, but telling, Thailand, going to, South America, going to anywhere else, saying, look, get off of this oil. We will sell you the stuff to do it. So now when it starts to pinch them, then it's a problem. Now I'm going to say one last thing, which is that's all we've been talking about oil and gas. One thing we haven't been talking about are some of the products. This is where the real pain, I think, could emerge. And two products in particular, jet fuel and diesel. And the reason for that is you don't just need crude oil to produce those things. You need distillates, mainly naphtha. Naphtha mostly comes from the Middle East. And you can produce it elsewhere, but we do not have any backups for naphtha. We don't have the same stockpile. And that's why Europe is saying they may run out of jet fuel in weeks. And that is a big problem.
That's a
Uh,
big problem.
it's a big problem. Like California so far has been keeping pace, but people are getting nervous. LAX is saying, look, we're okay. We've got stockpiles for now. But again, if this lasts more than 6 weeks, this is going to be an issue. And when we keep talking about months, how long this war is going to go, the summer is coming. And usually we say winter's coming, right? But the summer is the real problem because all of these things are what we use in the summertime, diesel and jet fuel, like transporting stuff through trucks, flying. And it's not clear what is going to happen. And that's where, again, the Chinese may say, wait, we need to still fly our things, our product to market. We need to truck our products elsewhere. So wrap this up by the summertime.
Wrap
It's a long answer. It's a long answer, but it's just, there's so much going on here that all kind of connects.
A lot
For
of
the record, I
complexity.
would rather be stuck in the summer than mobile in the winter, but that's just
yes. And the Europeans would 100% agree with you. They're like, fine. You know, like you said, the Germans and the turnips, they're like, yeah, we don't need to fly anywhere, man. We don't need to drive anywhere.
Well, so
we've got EV trucks.
The Germans also have trains. And
they have a better system.
The Americans kind of don't have trains.
No, we don't have anything.
We don't have anything. Troubling.
It is troubling. I want to add one other thing, which is the American point that Galen raised. Like, the U.S. is benefiting. Yes, the U.S. is a much bigger oil producer than it used to be. There are these conversations around, big tankers that are, steaming their way towards the Gulf of Mexico from the Persian Gulf. Rory Johnston, who's a commodities analyst, first noticed this and seeing all these very large, crude containing ships heading towards Texas, because this was a boon to America. And Donald Trump retweeted, or actually just stole Rory's point, but then truthed it or whatever the fuck he's talking about. But like to this point of everybody's buying American. It's great, but that's just 1 million barrels per day extra. And that's something, but it's not a whole lot. Like the US, yes, we are the largest producer, but it still can't account for this hole that exists. And, that 1 million extra comes at the cost of American consumers. That's oil that gets out. And that's why we used to have an export ban. And that export ban may come back if Trump wants to wield that sword. It was Biden and the Democrats actually who first lifted it, but that's something to think about as well in this conversation.
That would be a bad sign, certainly.
It would.
And to your point, it wouldn't help that much with the distillates. Wouldn't help that much.
No, and I mean, one thing they could try to do, and is wield these kind of cudgels of federal overreach, otherwise known as the Defense Production Act, and other kinds of things they can do to force people to produce naphtha. They could do that,
but it's inefficient, right?
It is, right? Yeah. As any state intervention in the market, as we fought an entire Cold War over this very premise of state. Should the state control the economy or not? Like, that is the entire ideological battle. And if Trump wanted to do that, he could do that. But yeah, terribly inefficient. God knows what would happen to markets if refineries and other midstream operators were forced to start producing stuff they normally wouldn't be producing.
Right. There's a reason why they don't produce it, right?
Exactly.
It's like, we don't have the right equipment.
They don't have the advantage. Yeah.
The comparative advantage. It's like we produce the wrong type of oil. You need heavier oils, right?
Yeah, there's a lot there too. That's right. A lot of it is kind of, a story of engineering. But again, if you really wanted to do it, you would eat that cost. Right. So,
well, it sounds like, based on what you're saying, you would rather be in the position China is in and have invested heavily in alternative sources of energy. But I guess that's a question for another time.
Makes sense.
One thing I wanted to ask is, if the Red Sea lane does come under fire, and I have no idea if that will happen or not, but we saw just last year that the Houthis are, despite not being a massive state fighting force, able to wreak havoc in that shipping lane. And I think there have been some Iranian spokespeople saying, like, if this blockade continues, this will be something that they try to target. What effect does that then have on prices? Because I think my understanding is the Saudi pipeline gets about 7 million barrels a day to the Red Sea, and that's where most of this stuff is getting diverted. Now we're talking quite a bit of oil and gas being taken off the global market.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the Bab al-Mandeb, which is kind of that little narrow part that the Houthis have claimed they can shut down the same way the Iranians have shut down the Strait of Hormuz between the Red Sea, basically, and Asian markets, if you want to think about it that way. It would certainly cut off a lot of oil exported from the western part of Saudi Arabia to the Asian markets, but it would put a lot of strain on the Suez to try to get that oil out. It would add a lot more time and cost to oil shipped out. It wouldn't completely shut things off, but that will have an effect on prices. But I don't think it will have a larger effect than just the temporal one, which is the longer this goes on in general, the higher that price will go. And the more that gap will shrink that we talked about between spot and futures. Now, again, with gas, it's another problem. 5% of the world's LNG goes through the Red Sea, and that would create a real price problem for the Europeans because American LNG is more expensive. And that would you would see a return to gas prices that we saw in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, almost a doubling. And again, that's a question of winter more than anything else. So that could have a big effect. I'm not sure that would happen. That closure, I don't think they have the capacity to do it. But if they did, it would certainly be a hindrance to the Saudis. But I don't see it as a much bigger problem than what we already kind of have.
That might be right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
interesting.
interesting.
It's unclear. Yeah.
Yeah, they've had the capacity to cause similar problems to what the Iranians were doing in the Strait of Hormuz, certainly. And it was enough of a problem that I think shipping still hasn't fully recovered from a few years ago out of the Red Sea.
That's true.
Right? Yeah.
That's true because they're still, I mean, it's a question again of cost. It's like, do you want to risk it? Do you have enough insurance premium that if somebody struck your ship, could you handle that loss? And some major shipping companies, some of them would say, yeah, okay, fine. That's the cost of doing business. Maybe I'll lose a ship. There's not that many companies that are like that. And so all the rest are like, I'm not going through there that's the same thing. And it's true that since I think the peak passages, have not recovered.
They haven't.
In the Red Sea. And so that's kind of why you had all these attempts to circumvent it somehow, but there's still no good answer to it. I mean, I take that back. There is a good answer, which is what we were talking about earlier, which is we have a whole other energy system we could rely on that doesn't need to deal with any of this. And
Seems
again,
like it's going to accelerate. Yeah.
It is. And I think it's going to accelerate if you can get that stuff to market. And which is getting back to this point, which is great. You want to buy Chinese PV photovoltaics. Well, it still needs to get on a ship to get there. But I do think to hit that point even harder, this is probably the strongest message to any other country that is an energy importer to shift, to decarbonize and electrify. As anything we've been shouting about for the last 11 years since the Paris Agreement, this is probably the most effective. Is you can keep on this crazy, effective, what is it, these bucking Broncos at those, in bars in Texas and these energy conferences. And it's that's the oil markets. That's literally what it is. It is just up and down versus you pay a big upfront cost for the product initially, that's capital expenditure, and then you have no operating expenditure. So people are going to do that. And that's kind of what solar, wind, geothermal gives you. And it does seem to me that is what people are getting out of this rather than trying to build another pipeline to circumvent both of these choke points.
So silver lining in this otherwise very gloomy cloud that we're talking about, maybe in the long run, this is actually a good thing. Maybe it'll even catalyze change here in the United States, because one thing Americans do tend to look at, irregardless of their political orientation, is the bottom line. To your point about driving actual behavioral change and investment, it's this is too expensive, so we're just going to do this other stuff. And it's it doesn't matter if you're a red state, blue state. It's some of our red states are actually the biggest producers of renewable power at this point.
That's right. Yeah, Texas is the biggest generator of clean electricity. And I think that's right. The pocketbook phenomenon that political science has documented, for decades now, I think is one big consequence of this. If gasoline prices remain high, they're about $1.20 up per gallon compared to before the war. Diesel is up much more, almost $3 a gallon.
And that's
If you're going to
reflected in
see
core inflation. Like that's reflected in anything that's
exactly,
shipped. Yeah.
exactly, and like that, if that persists through November, obviously there will be quite a bloodbath for the GOP, and that's the biggest thing, right? People will look to that. It's our most visible price in the economy is the price of gasoline. People know that much easier than they know the price of eggs or milk or whatever else. But yeah, the longer that goes on, the worse
Yeah.
for the American administration. And then the other piece of it, I suppose, is to say, I mean, it's silver lining. I think to get back to this point about pressure on the Iranian regime, I think there is some point at which economic degradation, will turn people on the regime. Even the strongest regimes can't withstand prolonged economic depression.
And that was happening, by the way.
Yes, exactly.
to
And
this
that was
war.
happening. That's what sparked those protests
It was-
in January. And that keeps going on, then you may see the regime crumbling.
And that's not the first time that's happened. I mean, the
No.
2019 ones, death to the Ayatollah, the 2022 ones, Green Movement, student protests in 99, those not so much about economic matters. But yeah, I mean, I take your point, and I think I heard someone make this about the Iran-Iraq war, which was like that war, yeah, we had toward the tail end, the war of the cities. But for the most part, it's like a World War I style trench warfare type change where most civilian targets are spared. And that's obviously not what we're looking at now. I want to one thing that's like on the current situation and like one looking further down the road. So I heard Jason Bordoff give an interview where he was like, at some point, reality is going to catch up with the markets. I guess I'm just curious, is that how you think about it? Like, are the markets, I guess, not accurately pricing what we're currently dealing with? Because what you said about all the strategic reserves, actually, it makes me think maybe they are pricing it correctly.
Yeah.
And then the second thing, also a Jason Bordoff question, he and Megan O'Sullivan wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, called The Return of the Oil Weapon, where they basically said, we're going to see what we're seeing right now, essentially energy weaponized for political purposes, the way it was in the 70s. But I guess, given what you and Steve were just talking about, that this incentivizes people to get off of this, what you make of that argument over the long term.
Yeah, those are good questions because I'm a big fan of Jason Bordoff's work and work with some of his people at the Columbia Global Energy Policy Center, or Center on Global Energy Policy, CGEP. But it's interesting. I used to interface a lot with folks like Javier Blas and other oil journalists, and I've been talking with a lot of these folks the past couple of months. That take a very different view. Javier, for example, would say the market does seem to be pricing this appropriately, and that it's not a shock the same way that 73 was a shock for all these reasons. We have spare capacity, we've got reserves, we've got all kinds of things we can do when it comes to crude oil, and again, take all the exceptions for natural gas and the other stuff aside. But so I think there is that sense that we're not. I wouldn't say the markets are not properly pricing them in. I think they just continue to think that this war is not going to go on indefinitely, that it's not going to be Russia invading Ukraine. That moment led to such high prices because I think people perceived, and accurately so, that when Russia invaded Ukraine, they were going to be there and they were going to stay there until they decided that it was time to pull out. And that is a multi-year phenomenon, and that has been borne out. Here, people talk in terms of weeks and months, and that's kind of the case. In terms of when reality is going to catch up, it does seem to me you'd have to do the math on those strategic petroleum reserves that exist. For some countries, that can be up to a year. For others, it's 90 days, right? And so you still have kind of that 6 months on average period where, things are going to stay roughly where they're at now, which is not great. Prices are high, but we're not going to see that $150, $200 a barrel oil. I think as soon as you get there, to Jason's other point, which is like, and I think this is what he meant by that may be the point where reality catches up. If we fast forward to August and this is still happening, that's that moment. And that's that. Now, in terms of oil being a weapon, I think that's right. I mean, that's what we're seeing. I think it's a less powerful weapon though. I mean, we were seeing that today. Like if every single war game, and I think you and I have talked about this, Galen, like every single war game ever around this situation included the Strait of Hormuz, right? And I think you guys have talked about this in the show. I mean,
it was also confirmed that they told him, Trump, like, hey, this is probably what they'll do. Like the New York
exactly
reported that.
Everybody knew that. And that used to be the doomsday scenario for energy analysts as well. And that would have been the ultimate sword to wield when it comes to the oil weapon. They did it. The global economy has not completely crashed. For some places, it certainly has. But we are not in a major recession. So I question the kind of veracity of that argument of the oil weapon being back the same way it was there. Because 73 was such a different moment in time, and no one had any idea how to respond. And 79 too, right? And then you follow that up with basically that kind of explains the entire 1980s politics, right? As a reaction to so much of what happened because of the energy crisis in the 70s. And you're not seeing that right now. So I'm not sure. And, you know, I was at a webinar, actually not a webinar, it was just a Zoom meeting a couple of days ago with national oil company officials. And they did not see this as that major a crisis for them. They were saying, we can still get the materials we need. We're going to ramp up our production. You know, they're still aiming to hit their targets. There's about more sustainability issues related with the national oil companies, but this was not a crazy moment for them. And that was quite interesting. You know, the Nigerians, the Brazilians, the Guyanese who don't have a national oil company, but not seeing this moment as one that was like a World War III moment is quite telling. To say, all right, this is quite an inconvenience for a lot of people. It increases our bottom line. We can keep producing. We have the ability to do that. And it doesn't really change anything. Right. They're worried about fuel switching, but that's kind of a different story. So
yeah. I was going to ask you about demand destruction, actually.
Yeah.
And to like the point we've already made about this switch to renewables, right? We kind of have the short-term, medium-term, and long-term effects and the gradient between them. Right. And if this goes on for long enough, then you start to get demand destruction. You get efficiency, you get replacement with alternatives. And the pain really comes in the short term for those who are not prepared. And it kind of seems like, given what you've told us about the major Asian economies, like they're actually prepared. And like they might be so prepared that like they can actually substitute in real time to a certain extent. Other countries that are developing are not as far along. They're in deep doo-doo.
Yes.
But maybe they can get loans, get some solar panels. China's still happy, right? So I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, so if I'm at the head of a national oil company, I know that there's some kind of glide path to this asset that I'm sitting on no longer being that much of an asset. And the world is on that glide path, right? It's like we are headed towards, not net zero, but like, it's just taking a long time, and maybe this is accelerating it, but I can still extract a lot of revenue. So this has bumped up my timeline somewhat. It's unclear how far, right? But it's like, no, it's actually business as usual. I guess the difference would come and I think you said this earlier, is like, okay, taking oil off the market is one thing if we can restart production. If we cannot restart production, that's a different matter. So if the Iranians were to slash out and start blowing up oil infrastructure, or the Americans within Iran, right? That perhaps is a qualitatively different matter, because it's no longer a matter of like drawing down reserves, knowing that there is something available to fill them back up again. It's like, no, we're actually going to permanently go down to this level, or more permanently, right? That's a bigger problem.
It is a bigger problem. It's interesting because this speaks to the fears of a guy named Sheikh Yamani, who was the first or one of the early ministers for the Saudis, who has this famous quote that the Stone Age did not end for lack of stones, and the oil age too will end, and not for lack of oil. And he was so worried that like the demand destruction basically, and that you have the Saudis who are the petrostate of petrostates, knowing that it's not about peak oil, it's not about this. We have so much more oil than people think, because the higher the price is, the more incentive it is to find it. but people are really worried about demand destruction. And I'll give you one number, which is the International Energy Agency's kind of announced pledges scenario. That's basically an analysis that says, what would oil demand look like if everybody, stuck to their pledges for the Paris Agreement, not anything beyond. And that's not a very ambitious scenario. That's not net zero.
Right.
That sees oil demand at 2050 of 55 million barrels per day. That's about half.
Less than half. Yeah.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
now that's a question for countries that say, well, wait a second, am I going to be able to be one of those 55 million barrels? For many countries, the answer is no. It costs too much to produce. And for many national oil companies, they have what are called stranded assets. This is kind of the work of people at the Natural Resources Governance Institute and the World Bank have shown this, that investments by places like Uganda, Egypt, Indonesia, Azerbaijan, their national oil companies are not going to see return on investment simply because of demand destruction. And that is only going to accelerate because of this war. That was based on pledges, which again, were not terribly ambitious. Whether or not they can hit that is one thing, but now you have real consumer appetite for it. And what that means is that for a lot of these countries, it does not make sense to double down on oil. The US included, by the way. Our oil is quite expensive to produce. Who's going to be the last one pumping, as my old advisor David Victor used to say? It's going to be the Saudis. It's going to be the Kuwaitis. It's going to be the Emiratis. And maybe the Iraqis now. And that right there, you kind of start to add up a number of the major national oil companies. You can get to 55 pretty quickly. You add in maybe Brazil with their offshore and a couple other places. And so that gives you a picture of what the world might look like in 2050 and who's going to be wielding this weapon. But that's not a lot of countries. And that's probably, I would say at this point, an optimistic scenario. I would think more, highly of scenarios that look at 30 to 40 million barrels of demand by 2050. And again, now you're talking about like 4 countries. And so that's fine. The world's going to need some oil for petrochemicals, for plastics, for some things that are hard to decarbonize. But that's a huge reduction. And so this is the moment for all these other countries to decide, like, are you going to be either stuck with the stranded asset, or on the other side as an importer, are you going to be stuck, importing basically what's a legacy fuel and being backwards? Or can you leapfrog and save some money in the process?
Yeah, and maintain independence when stuff like this goes down, right?
That's the big, I'll say one other thing, which is like the craziest thing for so long is that, the oil executives, when I've gone to these meetings, the CEOs of some of the major oil companies, they always love to talk about the triangle of energy, which is like energy security, affordability, and then kind of sustainability. They love to kind of include that. And they're like, and they like to talk about sustainability, but they always were winning the argument on energy security when it comes to oil and gas, meaning that oil and gas is necessary for energy security. The tables have turned. And I think it is clear that oil and gas is not only not essential for energy security, it is the reason for energy insecurity. And I think that is something that is going to be more and more painfully aware to many other countries. You mentioned some of the Southeast Asian countries that are not as well positioned, many sub-Saharan African countries that are not as well positioned. But that's like the more interesting legacy of this war may be like, oh, well, if you want energy security, you should be, hitching your wagon to renewables.
Right.
And that's crazy. Nobody would have thought that 10 years ago. I mean,
by the way, when you say renewables, you can just also sub in China.
Exactly. I mean, they're the winners, which like makes me really frustrated as somebody who, we live in America. We've been working on kind of American energy issues for so long. The United States has innovated almost all of this stuff, and we've just ceded ground. And it's like, why? Why did we make this stupid own goal? And we could have been winning those economic wars, basically, and out competing China and on some things, not everything.
It's funny how the innovator's dilemma applies to countries too.
Yeah, it does. It does. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Like this is the same thing, and it's just, we have moved backwards on it. And China's going to be winning on it.
Yeah.
As a result.
And I kind of tie all of this to the key political question of the day then.
Yes.
I'm actually fascinated to hear, it doesn't sound from listening to you, Pasha, like the current situation is as bad as I anticipated. Although I take you're saying like if this reaches into call it
Yeah.
September, like now,
Oh yeah. Yes.
now
Yeah.
we're talking real problems.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or
Yes.
or if the assets are blown up, right?
Well, so okay,
Yes.
so these are my
Yes.
questions. Actually, it's perfect. It's perfect segue. Like,
Yeah.
if this doesn't bite as hard as some have anticipated, I'll put myself in that camp. Like, is Iran's hand actually quite a bit weaker than I would have thought? In which case, do they then have the ultimate incentive, as Steve just said, to go after their neighbors' oil and gas installations?
Yeah, this is a good question because, I remember somebody was talking about this at, after Zero Week, this big kind of oil party, if you want to call it that, down in Houston, which I refuse.
Sounds awesome.
It sounds awesome.
Is there a big renewables party?
There are a Climate Week in New York and a
In
Climate Week
LA.
in San Francisco, in LA.
Yeah,
It is
yep.
far nerdier than you can ever imagine. But no, I refuse to go to Zero Week for lots of reasons. But a lot of the talk that came out of it was, did Iran actually end up playing a weak hand? And I think because of the non-reaction by markets, I mean, it's reacted, but the way that people had been talking about $200 a barrel oil, that has not happened gets exactly to your question, Galen. Like, I would not say that this is a particularly strong hand. This was the thing they played. Now, will it force them to play a more aggressive hand, which is going after, targeting other things? Perhaps. And then it'll be a question of how markets respond to that. They did try though, and they did not succeed, right?
They tried
to.
Yeah.
Exactly. They started to, and even with the LNG plant in Qatar, I think they had intended to do much more damage than they ultimately did. They had been trying to hit more Saudi assets and they didn't. And so, but I think if they do, and then you have this question like back to the LNG problem, and that the reason that nobody talks about that is because that's a much smaller market. But then you're talking about 4 years of oil being offline from a certain facility. That's trouble, right? And that's a hole we can't fill with demand destruction right away. 20 million barrels a day is not something that we can just wipe off. Like even during COVID, when nobody was going anywhere, we still did not have significant demand destruction. I think it was 3 million barrels a day, if that.
Wow.
Right. And so that was
it?
complete and utter shutdown of the global economy.
Yeah.
Still only had a 3 million barrel per day. Like
we couldn't even get toilet paper to the grocery stores.
Yeah. I mean, it's insane, right? And the reason for that is like ships were still moving and DoorDashers were still driving. Like it was like there was not, but it's really hard to destroy 20 million barrels a day of demand that quickly. Now, the other kind of point for that though is like, we have an instance of this. We have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The hand that Russia played and that Iran is playing now, Europe basically increased their renewables capacity 25% in 2 years after the invasion of Ukraine. And then effectively now, as of end of 2025, European renewables capacity is now the largest source of electricity generation. It has overtaken fossil. So wind and solar alone are at 30% of electricity generation. Fossil is at 29%. And then you have nuclear. So if you add nuclear to wind and solar, and then you have hydro, which is a weird thing, now you're at almost 70% of Europe's electricity is generated by non-fossil sources. I mean, that was a big direct result of the war, coming from a period where fossil was about 40% to 50% of electricity generation. That's pretty big demand destruction, but it took 3 to 4 years. Right. And it's just one sector. And it's the easiest sector to fix, which is electricity generation. So I think you could see that. But yeah, I think the hand that the Iranians have played here could ultimately be shown to be too weak because we have too many other tools to deploy. And it's kind of like, somebody used this analogy, which is, they have played their hand. It's the Strait of Hormuz, funny. But like a straight is not a particularly strong hand in poker. But that was my reaction to it. I was like, a straight's not the best hand, man. There's like so many more hands that beat a straight. So it's not clear that that's like the best analogy to use. Like
such as the flush. Yeah,
exactly. Exactly. Right. It's like, how many instances have we seen somebody, feel so strong and confident about a straight, and you're like, oh, you just got beat by a
Too
full house
many
and by a
from my
triple flush.
perspective.
Yeah, that's right. But
I mean,
yeah,
it obviously depends on how you define victory.
yes,
You know, we've been saying like pretty consistently, we think Iran is winning. Now, if the goal is regime change, they definitely are winning. You know, if the goal is to get a better nuclear deal, you know, it's more mixed. But like, do you think they are winning? I have to say, like, this has somewhat shifted my
yeah,
opinion on like how much leverage they have. Although you are saying if this drags on for a while, like, watch out. So
They have
yeah.
enough. Yeah.
They have enough. I mean, they are winning, but at a tremendously high cost, I think.
oh
And
no,
that's
no
where,
doubt, no doubt.
yeah, and that's the challenge for any regime, which is, you may be holding off, and the taste of that victory in people's mouths is not going to last. And I think, a few months will pass. Let's say everything ended today, and they could show, the Ayatollah, the mullahs could show that we stood up to the world and won. People would be happy, and a lot of the country is very much in support of that. But like 3 months go by, 6 months go by, and they're like, well, wait, the economy is still a wreck. We have still not been, given the things we were asking for back in December. Like, it's a victory that obviously a lot of people have died. So they, whether they were winning comes from a perspective of, well, for how long, and at what point will that turn for them? But then on the other side, like, if you think about it strategically, I would say if they are able to secure a deal that looks like the JCPOA, that's likely to be a win for them.
Well, if it's not a win for them, it's a loss for Trump.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, for sure, right? I mean, but that he doesn't care about that, right? He killed NAFTA, then he wrote NAFTA again. You're like, okay, so like he doesn't have any problem with doing that. Yeah, it's like, I don't think he has any challenge with that. But like,
then I guess like the key question remains, like, are they going to get a nuclear weapon? Because then
I mean, the challenge with one of the things that I think they have suffered real losses on is the targeting of human capital on kind of the nuclear side. It does seem as though, the Israelis were targeting nuclear scientists even more so, bombing universities, which, of course, is a war crime, but, destroying a lot of the human capital in terms of knowledge of the nuclear program. That does set somebody back quite a long time. I also just don't know, what it is that explains why they have never been able to acquire one. And I think that's a harder question to answer. They seemingly have been on the cusp for 2 decades, going back to George W. Bush, right? Talking about this, and has not materialized. And whether that's just incremental damage by Israel and others has just kept them back, or there's some fundamental problem that they cannot breach that threshold. And I don't know the answer to that. And I think maybe, but my sense is that there has been a lot of damage to their nuclear program. And even if the stockpiles haven't all been damaged, I think it does seem to me that they have been set back in terms of that side of things. But yeah, I ask myself that question a lot. I'm like, what? So what has it been that has prevented this?
I'm a little bit less persuaded that the human capital is a huge hit, just because like this is now 80-year-old technology.
True. Theirs could come in. That's a good point. I mean, yeah, that's
You can ask Claude. You can ask Claude to make a new nuclear weapon. It won't do it, but like it could.
Yeah, no,
right?
I mean, weaponization is a challenge, but like they were working on that, we now know, in 2003. And then they saw Saddam fall and were really fearful, and that's why they halted weaponization activities. So the bigger challenge is always acquiring the fissile material, which in this case involves digging into tunnels to get it out.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you could question whether they were motivated enough, and if they were just okay with being a latent nuclear state. I'm sort of two minds about that. I think they were fine getting right up to the edge, but wanting to have the option of getting one. Like, I think the biggest reason they didn't is because they were worried that if they got too close, this is what would happen.
Yeah.
And then I think they saw in Trump someone that they couldn't do business with, so they had fewer reasons to hold back, especially after the deal got torn up in 2018. So the motivation part, I think, is gone. I mean, now they have motivation in the world
Yes.
to go and get it. In fact, I would argue in purely power political terms, they'd be very stupid to not go do that. Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is going to be if they can't get that 60% enriched uranium. They also have a large stockpile of 20% enriched uranium. They're going to have to restart the enrichment process, which, as Steve and I have talked about, they'll do at a new site that's not susceptible to American bunker busters. But I don't know how you're going to stop them at that point, although maybe their services are so penetrated by Israeli and American intelligence assets that that's going to be a problem. But I'm very worried about that at this point. It's like,
I have questions about that too. I wonder if we've killed all of our assets as part of this war, right? It's like we've killed so many people that like some of them had to be assets that were embedded with the targets.
I mean, the other thing, like, I take your point, but like I make the point all the time, like if we, what is it, Project Ahmad goes back to like 1987. So it's been a long time. On the other hand, like since they felt safe to move forward with the program, which dates to like 2006 when they see the US bogged down in Iraq and in no position to go to war with another country in the Middle East, like you see the centrifuge production go up pretty steadily. Even during Stuxnet, it kind of levels off for like a year and then jumps back up. And then once Trump tore up the JCPOA, like they moved pretty quickly to 60%. So like, I suspect they have the ability to do it, you know, assuming
I don't know.
Get that enriched uranium out of the ground.
Yeah, I would defer to you two on it because I mean that it does get down to some core questions about, you know, nuclear proliferation and IR theory around this as well. I mean, the motivations and things like that. I mean, it goes back to another point we talked about, which is the, you know, involvement of outside actors. You know, to what extent are now the Chinese going to contribute? And they've never really been open to anything, I think, on this front with the Iranians, but
not with the Iranians, but with Pakistan, you know.
Exactly. They don't have so maybe their minds have changed on this. Maybe the Russians have. It's not clear. That would change a lot of things, though, I imagine.
Tell you whose minds have not changed on this. That's the Israelis.
Yes. Right.
And maybe we close with a quick discussion of what they're up to in Lebanon. I guess there's a ceasefire in Lebanon too. I guess my question for you, Galen, and maybe for Pasha as well, is whether it is possible to hive that conflict off from the larger U.S.-Iran confrontation in any meaningful way, or whether the Iranians and the Israelis won't allow that to happen.
Yeah, at this point, I kind of think no.
Okay.
Which is somewhat of a reversal of what I said either last week or 2 weeks ago, which like, I think this has actually pushed Hezbollah even closer to Iran. You know, like I don't mind the word proxy, but like Hezbollah is in a very different country on the other side of the region. It is in an Arab state, or a predominantly Arab state, not a predominantly Persian state. Like there's all sorts of differences. And so Iran was instrumental in setting up the organization. I think now like they are more closely aligned. And I think Iran like is looking for every type of deterrence it can get at this point. And Hezbollah has traditionally played that role. The other thing I'd say is like, to my surprise, right, when the shooting started here, when we did like, here's why this is happening now, if you wanted to make the case for it, right? And one of the things we said was Iran appears to be as weak as it has been in a very long time because its proxy network has been so devastated. It seemed like the conventional wisdom had shifted from like, Israel should definitely not go into Lebanon in 2024 because like last time they did that, it ended in a very tough war that was kind of fought to a draw and they suffered a ton of casualties. To, wow, Hezbollah has been systematically dismantled as a resistance movement to now like, oh, actually they have a lot left in the tank and Israel is now waging like a massive invasion of the country. I think Iran is probably looking at that and saying like, that is an asset worth holding on to. And I also think, per what we were saying, I don't think the Americans want this to keep going much longer, particularly if Pasha's right. And that's when you'll start to see energy prices bite even more. And that's going to give Trump an incentive to
twist some arms,
to push on them. And I think Tehran knows that.
Yeah. Right. That makes sense. I mean, it is an asset, but it's like, is it more of an asset than an Iranian nuclear weapon or control of Hormuz?
No, probably not. But.
Yeah. It's like, what would they be willing to trade? Right. And they have said in their 10 points, it's like, no, we want all our proxies preserved or whatever. But they cannot possibly think that they're going to go 10 for 10, right? In any
I
sort of
don't think so, but I also have a hard time thinking that they're going to offer better terms now than they did in 2015.
Yeah.
I just have a hard time believing that. Granted, they've been hit incredibly hard.
Yeah. Pasha, what do you think?
I don't have a very good insight on this. So I would go with what Galen's saying, because I have not been tracking the Lebanese Israeli situation as much. And I think the general thing to say is that, this goes back to the Iranian regime's ideology since the revolution, which was to have these proxies, to have this kind of, hegemony over the Middle East, the spread, the Islamic Republic, and that whole idea. And it's clearly something that's of value to them, both for security reasons, but also it fits with their story, their ideology. The other piece of it, I think that's important, is that a lot of the security forces that they tend to bring in during moments of repression are brought from outside Iran. There are a lot, of course, within Iran, but there is a reliance on that. And that is something that is part of the dictator's handbook. And that's not, just Iran, but, the ability to rely on repressive forces that are not your citizens is kind of like crucial to survival.
Like Wagner Group in Africa, or the Varangian Guard for the Byzantines, or whatever, right?
Exactly, right? I mean, there's a long history of this, and I think they see that Hezbollah is clearly their largest one.
And best trained and best armed.
And so I think if they were to lose them as an ally or a proxy, to use that term, I think they would be very hard pressed for them to maintain any of their other partnerships.
Good point.
I don't know though. But I just don't know about the situation on the ground, and it does seem as though this could be separate theaters, but maybe not to the point before.
Well, that's the other question. Is like whether the Israelis can actually defeat Hezbollah.
No,
that's a very open question, right?
Because it's, what does defeat mean? This gets to a point like we're seeing more and more in the 21st century, right? It's like, how do you beat unconventional warfare? Like, it's how do you do that? And
you don't.
I mean, Hamas is still around, and that is
exactly. That's a
far
great
weaker
point, right?
organization than Hezbollah.
Yeah. So how do you win those kinds of wars? And I don't know how many more times people need to see that, but
the other thing, like leaving aside that I think Iran does have some revisionist objectives, or as you said, like wants to export the revolution, and certain element thinking have cooled in some quarters in Iran, but not so much in others. Like, they do need to have some security mechanism. Like, they do need some deterrent, right? And if it's not going to be their ballistic missile program, which was something the Obama administration could not get them to stop, and at least one of the stated objectives of the war was to destroy their ballistic missile arsenal, then it's going to be their allies and the proxies in the region. Like, it can't be all of it, or it's going to be nuclear weapons. So I don't see how they're going to be able to give on all of these things, even if you think they have some malign objectives. Like, every state has a need for security. So, like, these are the main mechanisms they use. and they're
Yeah.
not going to give up all of those options.
Then in closing, I think we have to turn to the United States quickly.
Fun.
Yeah, a lot of fun, and try to understand what the Trump administration might accept in its climb down from what has clearly been a major mistake.
So I kind of want to hear from Pasha because one, I think you and I have like talked about, but also
Yeah.
like because if this isn't biting as hard as I thought it did, that does kind of change how I think about it. So
It's biting hard enough, man.
yeah, fair
Yeah,
enough.
that's the thing, which is like how long are they willing, the Trump administration willing to, keep saying, oh, don't worry, gas prices are high, they'll come down, they'll come down. This is a small price to pay and all of that. Yeah, it is a time question. I do think that that Trump, very clearly wants an out. It does seem that that's been obvious to many.
Yes.
And, there's already all the rumblings that have been going on for the last, 4 weeks about Cuba. Clearly that's like a nice out for him, is to just shift the theater of war and whatever I don't know what that's about.
Go
but
back
like,
to the Western Hemisphere.
yeah,
Go back
exactly.
to the
Come back.
classics.
Yeah, there you go. Right. And it's like they've already shipped now it's 60,000 service members who are in the Persian Gulf or going to. I think there's 50,000 there now. They're saying they're sending 10,000 more. I think that an interesting time point, for me would be, politically at least. Obviously, we have November, but
Yeah.
a lot of what November is dictated by is what happens in kind of primaries that are occurring across the country. June 2nd, for example, is the California primary, and the summertime, will tend to, like that June month, June, July is the narrative that has that long tail through to the fall. And this is kind of what killed Biden in many ways, is that kind of June, July supply crunch that was felt in 2022 after the invasion of Ukraine is what, inflation was much higher then than it is now. But that, I think if you have that as kind of on the calendar, if there's no resolution by, I would say, early June, Trump is likely to take whatever looks like he can call victory.
Whatever
which
you
is,
can get. Yeah.
Yeah, which is we've seen is kind of like anything. He can call anything victory.
So if that's true, then I actually do think the Iranians, at least compared to the JCPOA, do have an upper hand because like
the 2 months, yeah.
so like
that's fair.
the administration had been demanding no enrichment, right? Like no uranium enrichment whatsoever. The JCPOA was you could enrich to 3.67%, which is generally what's needed to run nuclear power plants. They had to ship out their stockpile of enriched uranium. What I'm seeing now is that the administration is asking for like a 20-year hiatus on this stuff, which like conveniently puts them 5 years beyond the sunset clauses that were in the JCPOA. So plausibly argue like I did this much better than Obama did. The Iranians, interestingly, are saying 4 or 5 years, which kind of makes sense because that's when the JCPOA sunset clauses would have kicked in, was 2030.
Right.
But yeah, I don't think if all they have to do is survive another, 2 to 3 months, I don't see them bending beyond what they already did in an earlier deal that was agreed to that the United States withdrew from, particularly since they have since been bombed twice in the midst of diplomatic negotiations.
Right. I don't know. I mean, that's the thing. What would they be willing to concede if it is just a matter of a few months, the Iranians, that is. But it's hard, right? Because it's hard to say how much more pressure they're going to feel, going back to that point about their domestic pressure of, the economic side. So it's being equivocal, right? And it's kind of an answer by me to do so. But I think it's hard to see at this point. It is hard to see. I think going back to what we were saying before, some kind of agreement that is somehow better for the United States than the JCPOA. Maybe it's more incrementally so, to your point. And that if that's the most likely outcome, then I think both sides would declare victory. And, people will look back at this and say, well, yeah, this is maybe the moment where, people got serious about, energy transition, transformations and things like this. China really showed its restraint, its ability to be a more, quote unquote, responsible hegemon, whatever they're talking about. But like, and to the point of like the inability of some of the things people thought had been strong weapons moves, whether it's closing the Strait of Hormuz or even on the American side, like a blockade and naval action, all this kind of stuff. And it would be a very strange moment in history to look back upon if this is something that ends in June with just that, a new JCPOA. And
Yeah,
everybody
I
walking
just-
away.
After
find
all
it-
of that.
I
yeah,
find it really hard to believe that's going to be the outcome, just given everything I know about Iran.
yeah. That, but I suppose, but I think the question is how much they are able to create an agreement that allows for enough non-compliance wiggle room, which does seem like something that they could do. And that was the fear of the original
Well,
JCPOA.
So if that's what's going to happen, this is the other reason I think Trump
Yeah.
does. I take your point that like
yeah,
NAFTA, we'll call it
Yeah.
something else and do it again.
yeah,
Like at a minimum, they are going to demand economic help. It's not going to be in the form of
Yes.
like, reparations.
They've got to rebuild. Yeah.
It's going to be a lifting of sanctions and an unfreezing of assets. And he railed against the JCPOA provision that lifted the sanctions that Obama was sending them
well,
millions of dollars. Like, I think at a minimum, they're going to need that to do a deal. And that politically could be at least a little tough to massage.
Or the tolls,
maybe, but
right?
the tolls, he's already lifted sanctions on oil. I don't
On
think
oil,
there's
yeah.
any. Yeah, I mean that's it. That's the real pain point for the original, like a lot of the IRGC guys. I think yes, in the 10-point plan they had called for reparations, right? I think there is that. The toll does seem like one version of that. That is a revenue stream. Nobody's gonna like that. But
No.
It's a terrible precedent.
yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
But so I think there will be concessions, but like economic opening, to the extent that they can achieve that, I would think is ultimately a better long-term win for the Iranian people and for, possibilities of true regime change. Like this goes back to, the ideas of modernization theory and comparative politics and kind of how do you get democratization? Well, you need, economic transformation and you need economic improvements to the point where people demand democracy. And, some of that's been proven wrong, but there's this kind of middle point where perhaps that is true. And we had started to see more Iranian civil society grow in the immediate years after the JCPOA, right before Trump killed it. And so it's not a very big window, but so that could be a good outcome for lots of people. But I don't know. I mean, I take your skepticism pretty seriously, Galen. I don't know if that is indeed going to be the outcome. I think all of these outcomes, I think, have relatively low probabilities, and you just add them up, and we have so many different outcomes. And so it's like, well, maybe this is the most likely, but it's like 10%.
You add them all
15%,
up and you get what the oil market is telling us, right?
Yeah, which is like, who knows
right.
what's going to happen? And like, it's clearly bad, but it's not so bad. And so
It's
that's
not so
kind of
bad.
exactly where we are.
There's clearly some tail risks that are
there is,
catastrophic.
there is.
Yeah,
And,
but
but
that's probably not going to happen. We're probably going to come up
No.
with some kind of deal in some
yeah,
number of
there'll be
months.
something.
Yeah.
And we'll see. I mean, yeah, exactly. I think,
But I don't think that deal is going to be the end of the story, is I guess.
no.
No.
I think that's right. I think it may be, it may itself be kind of like this ceasefire where we're talking about 2 weeks that could give a multi-year reprieve, but it's not the end of the story. It may even be less than that. Right. And so, and it's clear that the Iranians know that any deal signed with Trump is not a lasting agreement. And yeah, I agree. It's not the end of the story, but it may be the midterm end of the story.
A pause in the story.
Yes. A
Got it.
Well,
pause.
at this point, I
intermission.
think a pause sounds pretty good.
We're going to take a
Yes.
pause in the story of this show until
Yeah.
next week. Thank you so much for joining us,
Yeah,
Pasha.
thanks, man. That was great. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
it's awesome
Absolutely.
to see you and have you drop knowledge on us once again. It's been
No
wonderful.
worries.
Yeah, we'd love to
Yeah.
have you back sometime soon. Until
Yeah.
then, this has been another episode of Global Tantrum.